Hey guys, it's Andrew with another Love Tech video. Today we're going to be doing part 2 of 3 of the 2006-2007 Mac Mini lot upgrade project. Now these computers, as I mentioned in my prior video, if you haven't seen that, I'll leave a link up above and down below. But if you haven't seen that video, definitely go check that one out first before watching part 2 here on my channel. Now I'm super excited. 4 of these 6 Mac Minis we're actually going to be upgrading today. So let's get started and I'll tell you all about the specs and what we're going to be putting into these today to see if we can flip them for money on eBay. Stay tuned. Now, as you well remember, I purchased these 6 Mac Minis off of Facebook Marketplace. And I actually went in and did some tweaking and finagling around on one of them, and I'll get to talking about that in a second. Today, as I mentioned a little bit earlier on in this video, we're going to be actually performing upgrades to 4 of the 6 of these machines. The other 2, let's talk about those first, and then I'll get into some details on what we're going to be upgrading on these other 4 machines right here in front of me. So with that, Mac Mini number 4, I am actually going to be selling the way it is because this one has a DVD drive issue. For some reason, whenever I put a DVD into this Mac Mini, it just spits it right back out. Now I've tried going into the computer, cleaning out the DVD drive. I've tried cleaning the actual DVD drive itself, and nothing seems to work. Now, if you go out and try to buy a DVD drive for one of these computers, you're spending anywhere from 20, 30, even more on just a DVD drive, which doesn't economically make sense to upgrade such an old machine. So this one here I'm going to be selling as is on eBay. Now from my prior video here on the channel, all these computers are either 1,1 or 2,1 Mac Minis. This one here is actually a 1,1. It has only a 60 gigabyte hard drive in it, and it has a 1.66 Core Duo processor. It has 1 gig of RAM, and I was able to upgrade it to OS 10.6.8, which is the latest version of Snow Leopard that this machine can run. Now moving on to the second machine I'm going to be selling without doing any sort of fixes to it is Mac Mini number 3. Mac Mini number 3 has a 250 gigabyte hard drive in it, so I decided let me just try selling it with a 250 gigabyte hard drive. This machine, however, was kind of my test unit because I've actually never opened up one of these generation of Mac Minis before, and let me tell you, it is not easy to get into the bottom of these. There's a lot more prying than you may think to get into one of these machines, that is. However, I was able to get into it, and I was able to apply new thermal paste, give it a good cleaning, and do a complete wipe on the hard drive and reset it up. So this machine here, again, is a 1,1, so this one's from 2006, and it has a 250 gigabyte hard drive, 2 gigabytes of RAM in it, and a 64 megabyte graphics card in it. It has 10.68 Snow Leopard installed on it, and I have wiped the drive and done a clean install on it. So what I'm going to be doing with these other 4 Mac Minis is, as I mentioned before, upgrading all of these, and towards the end of this video, I'm actually going to be putting together kind of a big comparison table, and we'll be breaking down each Mac Mini and showing the exact upgrades and the costs of every upgrade that has been done to each of these machines. So we're going to first start out by upgrading Mac Mini number 2 today. Throughout this upgrade process, I'm going to be showing you how to install a new solid state drive in these machines, how to upgrade the RAM in them, and also change out the CPU and apply new thermal paste. This first machine today, we're going to actually be adding some additional RAM into it and then adding a 120 gigabyte solid state drive. We're not going to be performing a CPU upgrade on this specific machine, which I'll show a little bit later on one of these other machines. We'll be upgrading actually to the CPUs onto these machines here today. However, this one, we're just going to be doing the RAM and solid state drive upgrade and applying new thermal paste to the CPU. So before we get upgrading these Mac Minis today, I first want to talk about some tools we are going to need in order to fix these machines and upgrade them. So first off is we are definitely going to need some needle nose pliers. I highly recommend these for taking the CPU heatsink off, because getting these 2006, 2007 Mac Mini heat sinks off is a pain in the butt, and it's very easy to break the clips if you don't have these that are held in with springs. They're little plastic clips and they're spring loaded, and there's 4 of them that hold the heat sink on top of the CPU. Some other tools that we're going to be using today, I actually bought this pretty cheap magnetic mat off of eBay. I would recommend actually buying something a little bit better than this one. This one actually came to me and it's all warped and horrible. But these magnetic mats are super helpful if you're going through and wanting to do some upgrades on a computer and want to easily organize your screws and different pieces that you're taking out of the computer and putting them on the mats. That way you are not making any mistakes or getting any of your screws or components inside the computer messed up when you go ahead and put it back together. Another thing I highly recommend you go out and buy before attempting any of these upgrades is some sort of a computer toolkit. Now, I happen to have a iFixit toolkit. This inside has a lot of different tools that you can use to help get into these machines, take screws out, pry cables or ribbon cables up with, and stuff like that. So again, definitely go out and buy one of these. I'll leave a link to this one down below. I've been very impressed with it so far. I've been using it for a couple of months. Another couple items that you're definitely going to want to invest in order to do a proper cleaning on these computers is the following. So I went out and bought this container of 99% alcohol. Now, the nice thing about alcohol like this is it is safe to use on electronics. So you can clean electronics if there's dust or dirt or rust or any sort of grime inside of the computers. You can use alcohol and it does a fantastic job at cleaning the inside of electronics or even the outside of electronics of dirt and grime and such. So definitely go out and buy some alcohol. And then go and get some canned air as well. This will help get rid of any loose dust or debris inside of these computers. Another couple of things for cleaning I would recommend getting is some basic cotton rounds. These are great to be able to kind of scrub and be able to clean the outside or smoother surfaces on the inside of your computer. One thing I caution on using anything that has any sort of like cotton or ply on it is definitely do not use it on the inside of a computer on or around any sort of circuitry or circuit boards, because little threads of this can get stuck on things like that. So I'd highly recommend not using them on the inside, but these are great for the outside or areas that are not around any sort of circuitry inside of your computer. Also, while we're on this subject of cotton, Q-tips also work great for small places, so definitely is another good thing that you can try using to help clean the inside of a computer. And then finally, I would recommend using a toothbrush. Yeah, I know it sounds kind of crazy, but using a toothbrush inside with alcohol actually works very well for helping to scrub, but it doesn't leave any sort of residue behind like cotton can. And the last thing you're gonna need in order to do these upgrades is some thermal paste. Now, definitely go out and invest in some high quality thermal paste. Like a little tube like this will run about $6 to $7 off of eBay. This is Arctic Silver 5 thermal paste, and I highly recommend it because it does a great job. It's actually better than what Apple uses for thermal paste on their devices. Now, you might be asking, why should I replace thermal paste on a older electronic? Well, over time, that thermal paste becomes very hard and it doesn't do as good of a job at keeping your CPU cool. So that can lead to performance issues with your computer and also overheating issues. So I'd recommend, if you have a computer that is older than 7 to 10 years old, definitely, if you can, open it up, take the heat sink off and reapply some thermal paste. But as I'll show a little bit later on in this video, you'll want to make sure and go in and clean the old remnants of the old thermal paste off the CPU using some alcohol. Now that I've shown you all the tools that you're going to need in order to upgrade these computers that we have in front of us today, let's get to upgrading our first Mac Mini. All right, so let's get started with upgrading Mac Mini number 2. Now let's first off talk about the specs on this machine and what we're going to be upgrading it to. So this is a 2.1 Mac Mini. This was released in 2007. It has a 80 gigabyte hard drive in it currently, a 1.83 Core 2 Duo processor with 1 gig of RAM, and 64 megabyte graphics card. It is currently running Mac OS X 10.68 Snow Leopard, which is the latest release that can be supported on this machine with the amount of RAM it has in it. Now, what are we going to be upgrading this one to today? So, first off, we are going to be putting in a 120 gigabyte solid state drive. Now, this will dramatically help improve the performance of this machine, boot faster, and have stuff be able to save quicker to and from the disk, so it'll perform way better than it currently does. With that being said, I wanted to also take this Mac Mini to the next level with RAM. So currently this has 1 gigabyte of RAM in it, and I actually went out and bought another 2 gigabyte stick of RAM. Now, what this is actually going to allow us to do is to be able to upgrade this machine to 10.7, which is Lion. 10.7 Lion is a change in how Apple did architecture with their operating system. So Snow Leopard was the last full 32-bit support operating system. Lion shifted that dynamic and started using 64-bit architecture for the operating system to run. So it requires 2 gigabytes of RAM. So once we get this machine upgraded to 2.5 gigabytes of RAM, we'll be able to load 10.7 onto this machine. Now, at the end of this video, I'm going to break down the costs on all the machines and do a side-by-side comparison of before and afters again, so you'll be able to see everything that we've upgraded today on our Mac Minis. So the first thing we're going to do is take the top case off the machine. Now, this is one of the more tricky parts. There are a couple other tricky parts along the way as well, and I'll point those out as we upgrade this machine today. So for some of the upgrades we're going to be performing today, I'm actually going to be doing time-lapse videos on some of these because I don't want to take the full amount of time to, I mean, this video would be like 2 or 3 or 4 hours long if I actually showed you every single tiny upgrade that we performed to these machines. However, for the first solid state drive upgrade, for the first CPU upgrade, and for the first RAM upgrade and CPU thermal paste reapplication process, I'm going to show you guys exactly how you do this to your Mac Minis. So with that, let's get started and take this guy apart. Now, what we're going to do first is we're going to flip the machine over to the backhand side like this. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to inch our way into the computer itself. So in order to open this guy up, what we're going to do is insert our Jimmy tool into one of the sides of the computer. Now, if you are afraid that you're going to scratch the computer because it's metal on metal contact, is grabbing one of these like shim-like things that are in these iFixit toolkits and actually starting out back in one of these corners and just getting that kind of between the computer and the casing. And what that'll do is it'll make it a lot easier to be able to insert our Jimmy tool into this groove here and be able to kind of pry up and lift up. Now you can see all of our pins have actually been released on our Mac Mini here. So you can see how all of the pins along the side here and over along this side here have been released from the base itself, as well as the ones in the front. So now we're gonna flip our computer back over to be facing up like this, and then we're going to gently lift up on the casing to take our top or casing of the Mac Mini off the actual computer itself. And then you can see inside of our Mac Mini here. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to actually be taking the whole entire top piece where our optical drive, our hard drive is here, off, and that way we'll be able to get into our CPU, our RAM, and be able to upgrade our hard drive in this machine to our solid state drive. Now, one thing I should mention, there are some very, very fragile components in these computers. One of those being our Wi-Fi or airport antenna here. The one I actually opened up from before was actually slightly damaged already because somebody had already been into the computer and had finagled or done something with it and didn't put it back properly. So be very, very, very careful when taking apart these computers because they are extremely fragile. Another couple areas on these machines to be very, very, very extremely careful on is our Bluetooth adapter right here. This is all spring-loaded and just sitting in there kind of with a spring. That's a very fragile component. And then finally, the piece that I really want to point out here that is like super, super, super fragile, and I can't stress this enough because I completely screwed up when I took out the other one and I couldn't get seated back right for a while, is this ribbon cable here. Now this ribbon cable here actually goes from our CPU and logic board and connects over to our I/O ports back here on the back. So this helps run our USB ports as well as our audio port and a microphone and headphone port here. All right, so now I've taken apart the external housing on this Mac Mini and shown you a few of the very fragile components inside of it. Let's get to taking it apart further. So our first step in order to dismantle this Mac Mini is going to be actually taking the airport card out of this spring-loaded circuitry here. Now the reason for this is because this here is actually attached with a wire back here to the back of the computer. So this needs to come out in order for us to lift this component out of here in a little while. So to take the airport card out, what we're gonna do is these two black clips back here, we're going to squeeze these together and that will let us lift the airport card up. Again, it's spring-loaded. Be careful when you do this. This is one of the more fragile steps when upgrading this machine. So to do this, we just squeeze those together and it just lifts up on out of there. It springs up out of there and we have released our airport card out of this machine. Now you might not be able to see this on the video here, but this ribbon cable actually runs in here to a little brown clip that actually holds it into a socket. Now what you're going to want to do is take a really small tool like this one here. This is the iFixit spudger and it's a pointed spudger at the end. And what we're going to do is slightly on the left-hand side, slightly lift up just enough on the brown connector piece there to lift out this cable. Now, if you push up the brown connector that's holding the cable in too hard, what will wind up happening is you'll actually wind up breaking the brown connector out of its socket, and it is a pain in the butt to try to get back in. It's sometimes actually impossible to get back in. I thought it was impossible to get back in the last one I worked on because I kind of messed up on that part. However, I did eventually get it back in, but it did take a long time for me to try to get that cable clamp back in there to hold the ZIF cable in place. All right, now since we've removed our ZIF cable from the back, the next step is to remove the super drive plug in the front of the machine. Now this is actually up front here. You'll see next to the CMOS battery, there's a little cable off to the right-hand side. This cable here, what we're going to do is actually with a pair of tweezers like this, is actually go in here and lift up on this cable here. All right, so our next steps on taking apart this Mac Mini are going to be removing 4 Phillips head screws from each corner of the Mac Mini. So the first screw we're going to need to remove from the Mac Mini is up here on the bottom left-hand corner of the Mac Mini itself. If you work your way up in a clockwise pattern, there's going to be another Phillips head screw, which is going to be right in this area of the computer, which will be kind of just to the left-hand side of the last USB port on the back of the computer. Our next screw we're going to need to remove from the Mac Mini will be kind of under the airport card. It'll be right here. It's pretty easy to see. You just have to, again, have a Phillips head that can get down into that plastic slot to be able to take that screw out of there. And then finally, our last screw is down here by the IR sensor. And this is our IR sensor here on the Mac Mini. And there's a last Phillips head screw right here that you're going to need to remove as well. All right guys, so now that we got all 4 screws out, now we're able to actually lift the top part of the Mac Mini away from the bottom part of the Mac Mini here. So one thing to be careful of when we do this is this area here. This is called the interconnect assembly. And there's a little, this is like where your power indicator is and stuff. So this area here, just be very careful when you're lifting this housing part away from the computer itself. So just lift up. And again, make sure that your airport card kind of gets behind there like that. That actually lifted out of there pretty easily. So there we go. So now we've actually dismantled kind of our Mac Mini. So now we can kind of see the insides of the computer itself here. So looking at the two pieces, this is filthy. Like any Mac Mini, there's lots of dust and hair and all kinds of stuff from years past. So in here, this is our fan caked on with dust, not a surprise there. This is our hard drive, which we will be upgrading to a solid state drive in a few minutes. Then our super drive, if we flip this around to kind of the top here, this is what you saw before. This is our speaker for our Mac Mini, and then also our super drive. All right, so now let's look at the bottom part of the computer here. So for this computer, we're going to first off start by upgrading the RAM, and then we're going to take the CPU heatsink off. We're not actually going to be upgrading the CPU on this computer, but rather just applying new thermal paste. So I'll show you how to do that in a minute here as well. Once we're done with those two components and we've given this a good internal cleaning with alcohol in the certain areas that it needs it, and then also some canned air, then we're gonna move to the top part of our housing here, again, which I was showing you before. This is where our hard drive is, and we'll be putting our solid state drive into this area here, cleaning out the fan here, and then be assembling and putting our computer back together. So what we're going to do, I have my RAM set off to the side here in an anti-static bag. We are going to open this guy up and put a new stick of RAM in it. So before we get to opening that bag up, actually, we're going to take out one of these 512 DIMMs of RAM out of here. So we're just gonna pull our tabs back until the RAM comes up like this. Now what we're going to do is gently lift out the RAM. It sometimes requires a little bit of force to kind of pull back on it like that. Once you get the RAM removed from the machine itself, we're just gonna set that aside. So now what we're gonna do is open up our 2 GB stick of RAM, and we are going to put this into our Mac Mini. The first thing I wanna mention is make sure you never touch the gold pin connectors down here, because sometimes your oils and stuff from your skin can actually interfere with connections, and you have to clean that off then again. So again, don't touch the gold connectors down here. And then the other thing you need to make sure before inserting the RAM in here is you put it in the right way. So you'll notice on our RAM here, there is a little cutout, and this is over, if you're looking down at it, it's over from the left-hand side about 1/4 of the way. It's not like halfway. So you'll notice that, and make sure when you're putting the RAM in, you are putting it in the correct way with that pin over on the left-hand side where that break is, because if you put it in backwards, the RAM just won't go in. So make sure you align the RAM correctly when seating it in the RAM slot. Before I actually put this in here, I'm just gonna blow this out really quick. Make sure there's no other dust remnants in there. All right, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna put our new stick of RAM in. So to do this, we're going to gently push in until we don't see those gold pins anymore. Hold it at about a 45-degree angle like this. So once you don't see the gold pins anymore, you can then press the RAM down into its slot, and you should hear a clicking noise where those clips grab the RAM. It's that easy. You successfully just installed RAM on your Mac Mini. Pretty simple, right guys? So that's our first upgrade. Our next upgrade on this machine is going to actually be getting into the CPU and just reapplying some thermal paste to it. So let's get started with that. So one thing I did not know about this machine before I upgraded one of the prior ones that I had mentioned earlier on in this video is the logic board actually is not attached to the bottom housing of the case here. It actually is just sitting in there. So what we have to do is remove the whole entire logic board out of here and then squeeze the clips to release those pins on the bottom side of our logic board to get our heatsink out. Now, before we can actually take the logic board out, there's a couple more cables we need to actually disconnect on the logic board itself. The first cable being our power cable back here in the back right-hand corner if you're looking at the machine. Now, this cable again is pretty easy to remove. You just again make sure to lift up on the cable and it will come out of its slot just like we did on the one up here before we lifted that top casing piece of the machine off itself. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna get in here with my tweezers and get in under that cable and just pry that up. And then finally, we're going to need to release one more cable before we can actually take the logic board itself out of the computer. And that is the power indicator light cable, which is plugged in up here in the bottom right-hand side of the computer. So again, use tweezers to remove the connector out of there. All right, so now that we've removed both our power button cable out of the power button socket on the logic board and the power indicator light cable out of there, our next step, and this is our last step before we can actually take the logic board out, is we're going to need to use a T10 or Torx 10-bit head screw. And over here by the RAM, you'll notice that there's this weird looking cylindrical piece. What we're going to need to do here is take and use our T10 head and unscrew this. And this is kind of like our last thing, and we'll be able to then get our logic board off of the bottom part of the Mac Mini here. All right, so what you're gonna need to do now is we're going to lift up the logic board from the bottom casing on the computer. I would recommend using either a metal or a plastic spudger to do this. Take your preference here. Just be careful if you are using metal because you are going against the back of a circuit board. I'd be very careful about using metal actually now I think of it, but just be careful when you're lifting that out of here. Now, one thing you're going to want to make sure to be very careful of when you're lifting the logic board away from the bottom housing of the computer itself is the power indicator area here, and this is where your IR port sensors and all that stuff are for the Mac Mini. You want to be careful because the logic board itself actually kind of is rested underneath that. So if you just lift up on that, it's gonna potentially do damage to this sensor here. So make sure you kind of gently push that out of the way when you're lifting the logic board away from the bottom casing of the Mac Mini. Now you can see we've separated the logic board from the housing on the computer itself. Now again, be careful because on the bottom, there's a lot of circuitry as well. So be careful of your Wi-Fi antenna. Also be very careful of the GPU. There will be a thermal paste pad on the bottom part of the housing of the Mac Mini. So just make sure not to touch that because it feels very weird and you don't want thermal solution all over your hands. And again, be very careful with the bottom circuitry of the logic board because it's kind of like a double-sided logic board. It's a very unique logic board design for that matter. I've personally never seen a logic board being double-sided other than on the Mac Mini. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the heatsink off the logic board itself. Now again, to do this, you have to be super, super careful because these spring-loaded pins can easily break off the bottom. That's why at the beginning of this video, I highly recommend you get a pair of needle nose pliers to be able to kind of squeeze those ends together to be able to lift out those pieces out of the bottom. Again, these pieces are very hard to find if they break, and even if you were to go out and buy them, you'd most likely just have to buy them out of a used Mac Mini. So you'd basically have to go out and buy a whole Mac Mini just to be able to get these little plastic parts. However, with that being said, I'm gonna set this other bottom housing piece kind of aside here. And what we're going to do now is flip over this to the back. Again, be very careful when you do this. You don't want to damage any of the internal components on this. And on the back here of our logic board, you'll notice that these are the 4 little plastic clips here on the back. Now these are what we're going to need to squeeze kind of together in order to have those release from the logic board itself so the heatsink will come off so we can apply new thermal paste to the CPU itself. So what I'm gonna do now is grab my needle nose pliers and we will get to doing that. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna flip our logic board back over, and what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna lift the heatsink off of here. Now there is a sensor on here, so be very careful when lifting this off here. We don't actually need to lift and take the whole heatsink off the computer. You can actually just rest it kind of on top of the GPU here. So now you can see in here, we have the top of our CPU. We again are not upgrading the CPU. In order to upgrade the CPU, it's a pretty simple process once you got it this far. Once we get to another Mac Mini a little bit later on in this video, I'll actually show you the full process of taking the CPU out of here, but it's pretty straightforward. Basically, there's a regular head screwdriver in here. You just rotate this to the unlock position, and then you're able to lift the CPU right out of there, and you're able to put a new CPU in. But this one, we're not gonna do that with. So now we got the heatsink resting on top of the GPU. We're going to clean the old thermal paste off of the CPU itself and off the back of the heatsink for the CPU. Now, what we're going to do after we clean that off is we're going to apply some new thermal paste. Again, this is Arctic Silver 5 thermal paste. You can buy this off of eBay or Amazon for anywhere from $5 to $7. And a tube like this, for a processor like this, a tube like this should last you quite a long time, because again, you only need to put about a pea-size drop of thermal paste on here. Again, first what we're going to do is clean off the old thermal paste from the back of the heatsink and the CPU. So for that, we're going to use, again, alcohol. This is isopropyl alcohol, 99% isopropyl alcohol. And I'm also going to use just a cotton round to kind of clean this off here. You can also use a toothbrush. I have not actually tried using a toothbrush, but I feel like that's just gonna smear it around. This will kind of help absorb some of that old thermal paste off there. All right, so now we got the thermal paste cleaned off of the CPU and the heat sink very well. So now we're gonna apply some thermal paste to the CPU itself and then flip the heat sink back over and push those plastic clips back through to secure the heat sink back on to the CPU itself. Again, very easily, we're just gonna apply about a pea-size dab of thermal paste on top of our CPU. All right, so now that we have our thermal paste applied to our CPU, we're going to put the heatsink back on here. Now, to make sure you have your heatsink on your CPU correctly, you're gonna need to make sure that the cutaways for these pins are facing outward to the right and left-hand side, and these ones are facing kind of the front of the computer where the area is for the heatsink. So it needs to look like this. This is the back of your computer. Again, you have a cutout here, a cutout here, and then two cutouts at the top here. And that way you know you're putting your heatsink back on here correctly. Now this part here is a little bit difficult to put the heatsink back on here because you're gonna need to line it up pretty good, and then you're gonna need to kind of commit and put it down. And then what you're gonna need to do is lift the logic board up and then push the pins through. Again, do it in a cross pattern. That way it gets even pressure on both sides of the heatsink first, so your thermal paste doesn't go everywhere. And then what we're going to do now, this again part is very difficult to do and I hate it, but it needs to be done, is we're going to push. I would recommend starting out with this one, and we're just gonna push our pin back through. Use a spudger if needed in this process, and I find that that works pretty well. All right, so now we got the CPU heatsink back on top of the CPU. So now what we're going to need to do is just again in reverse order, we're going to need to sit this back into the bottom housing of our Mac Mini. And there you go. Now we've successfully put the logic board back in place in the back housing of the Mac Mini. Now what we're gonna do is just kind of reverse our process of what we did before. So we're gonna first grab our Torx 10 T10 bit and put this guy back in here and by the RAM. We're just gonna screw this back in here. That way this is attached to the bottom housing of the Mac Mini. Once we finish that, we're going to go back and plug in the power indicator and the power button. So there we go. We've successfully put the bottom housing of our Mac Mini back in here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to set this aside, and we are going to get to upgrading the solid state drive now on this computer. So now I set aside the bottom part of the Mac Mini. Now I'm gonna grab what I guess you would call the mid casing of the Mac Mini, not the top casing. Again, this is the part that has our logic drive, our hard drive, and our fan in it. And what we're going to do with this now is we're going to upgrade the hard drive in this machine. We're actually gonna move this 80 gigabyte hard drive from this machine over to another machine that only has a 60 gigabyte hard drive. And then this machine here, we're going to actually put a 120 gigabyte solid state drive into it. So in order to start this upgrade process, this is a pretty easy one compared to the CPU upgrade we did a little bit earlier on. You'll notice that there are 4 screws, 2 screws here, and then there's also 2 screws on the side of the chassis. So in order to take these out, I'm gonna grab a little bit bigger Phillips head bit. Once these 4 screws are taken out of the chassis here, we'll be able to slide the hard drive out of here. So now that we have all 4 screws out, we're going to actually push the hard drive towards the front side of where the computer would be, where the speaker is. So this will actually disengage it from the clip back here in the back, allowing us to remove the hard drive out of the computer. So you'll notice now that that slid it out of the SATA connection. And now what we can do is just come in here and gently lift up on the drive and take it out of the chassis. And what we need to do now that we've got the hard drive out, is we're going to get the solid state drive out of its packaging here. What we are going to need to do is transfer this foam piece from the hard drive over to the solid state drive. Now, we want to do this for a number of reasons, but the main reason being to help protect it from any sort of vibration or rattling. It's not as necessary to do this with a solid state drive because you don't have any of that spinning disc actually inside the drive. So in order to put our new solid state drive in, we just reverse the process that we did before. We're just gonna simply slide it in down here like this and line it up. And once you get that lined up, we're just going to simply push down on this and it will lock the SATA drive into the proper place. Now with that out of the way, we're gonna just reattach our screws. All right, so now we got our new 120 gigabyte SSD put into the middle chassis. We're gonna start actually assembling the Mac Mini back together again. So to do this, I'm just gonna rotate the Mac Mini so the front of it is facing me, the back of it is facing away from me. So now we are able to put this back on here like this. Just be very careful again when putting the housing back on the computer. So now we got the middle housing back on the Mac Mini here. We are going to now reattach the screws so the middle part of the housing seats on the bottom part on the logic board. All right, so now we got the 4 screws put back into their slots. We're going to want to reattach the hard drive thermal sensor down here. Again, that is in the front of the computer. All right, so now we got the thermal sensor cable placed back in its socket. The last couple of steps here are pretty simple. Hopefully the ZIF cable goes better than the first one I did. We're gonna flip this around and we are now going to route our ZIF cable over these 2 wires here. And we're gonna put that back into our channel and press down on the clip that helped lock it in before. Again, be very careful with this process. And again, it might be kind of dicey to get this ZIF cable to sit right. The last one I did, I completely messed up on, so hopefully this one will go a little bit smoother than the first one I did. All right, finally, the last step before we can put the top casing back on this Mac Mini is we're going to reattach the airport card into the spring-loaded slot. We're just going to press and squeeze the 2 black plastic clips and then press the airport card down. It should snap back into place. Again, be careful doing this step. So now we have successfully done the following to this computer. We've successfully gone in, we have cleaned the inside out, we've gone in and added a new 2 gigabyte stick of RAM. We've gone in, taken the CPU heatsink off, cleaned the old thermal paste off of the CPU and heatsink, applied new thermal paste, reset the heatsink onto the CPU, and then finally we upgraded the 80 gigabyte hard drive in this machine to a 120 gigabyte solid state drive and put it back together and did a good cleaning overall. That's what we've done to this computer today. I'm super excited. So now the next step is to put the top casing back onto the computer. So now we have successfully upgraded this 2007 Mac Mini with the solid state drive, upgraded RAM, and cleaned the old CPU thermal paste out and gave it a nice cleaning. So since this 3-part series is dedicated to showing you how to upgrade these machines, I'm not going to go into this video and show you every detail on how to install a fresh copy of Mac OS or OS X onto this computer, since there is nothing on the solid state drive, since it's a new blank drive. If you're wondering how to do that, go check out my 2010 5.1 Mac Pro upgrade video I did a couple months ago here on the channel. I'll leave a link up above for that, and you can see how to install a fresh copy of OS X or Mac OS onto a blank, brand new solid state or hard drive. So with that, after I get this computer plugged in and upgraded, I'll let you guys know, and then we'll be on to the next upgrade. All right guys, so I was able to get Snow Leopard installed on Mac Mini number 2 after putting the SSD in it and upgrading the RAM and reapplying thermal paste. Again, at the end of this video today, I will be showing you all the benchmarks and all of the side-by-side upgrades as to what we did to each machine. Now that we have Mac Mini 2 successfully upgraded all the way, we are going to now get into upgrading Mac Mini number 1. All right guys, so now I got the hard drive replaced in this with the 80 gigabyte from Mac Mini number 2. I've also gone in and added another stick of 2 gigabyte RAM to this. So now we have 2.5 gigs of RAM in this machine. And now I've gotten to the process from our last video where we had taken the heatsink off and cleaned the thermal paste off. So this is the process I wanted to show you firsthand of how to actually upgrade the processor. It's a fairly easy process. In order to take the processor out, we're going to twist this screw here 180 degrees until it faces the unlock symbol. You're going to turn the screw counterclockwise, and that will release the processor from the processor tray. Once you've released the processor from the processor tray, go ahead and lift up on the processor and you can take it out of its socket then. Just set it upside down like this, making sure, again, that nothing is going to get into it and damage any of the pins. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our 2 gigahertz Intel Core 2 Duo processor. Again, be very careful not to touch any of the pins on the bottom of this. And what we're going to do on this is we're going to ensure that the little yellow arrow here faces the little yellow arrow here. That ensures that we are seating the processor correctly into the CPU socket on the logic board. If you don't do this, you can really mess up your processor. So just be very careful, and again, look for the matching arrow symbols. That way you know it's proper. So we're gonna just set our new processor down here, and it should just fall right into place, just like that. And then we are going to tighten this back up. We're gonna turn the screw 180 degrees clockwise until it locks our new CPU in. And now we're just going to apply some thermal paste to this CPU and put our Mac Mini back together and go through the upgrade process. So once I get this all assembled back together, we're going to boot up this Mac Mini, and then we are going to flash the firmware on it actually, so it can utilize the full 2.5 gigs of RAM in this machine that we've added along with the new processor. So I'll be back once we get this machine back together. All right guys, so now I got Mac Mini number 1 kind of retrofitted, so to say. So I've put the 80 gigabyte hard drive in it, and I've also upgraded the processor along with the RAM. And I ran into an issue with the RAM, and I want to explain that really quickly here. So you know how I mentioned a little bit earlier on in this video that we need to flash the firmware to upgrade this machine. Since this is a 1,1, a 2006 Mac Mini that is, we need to flash the firmware to a 2007 Mac Mini. That way it can support additional RAM. However, I didn't completely realize that before going about doing this, so I've been spending the last few hours actually troubleshooting and figuring out why my memory modules aren't working. It turns out that the 1,1 Mac Mini only supports up to 2 gigabytes of RAM, not more than that, unless you flash it to a 2,1 Mac Mini firmware. So to do that, I'll put a link down below in the description for you guys to be able to go get this file. It's from DOSDude1, And this file patcher will make it so it will flash the firmware on your 1,1 Mac Mini and upgrade it to a 2,1 Mac Mini's firmware. So all you have to do, an important step here to mention, is you need to make sure you put your new processor in your Mac Mini first, your 1,1 Mac Mini. So you need to put the processor in, then you're gonna wanna run the firmware upgrade that DOSDude1 has provided. Then after that, you're gonna have to take apart your Mac Mini again, and then if you wanna put additional RAM in to upgrade it to say Lion or beyond, you'll then need to, again, take apart your Mac Mini and put additional RAM in it. So it is a little bit of a multi-step process, but I'm glad I'm hopefully going to be able to figure this out. So what I've done right now is I have shut down my Mac Mini. I've prepped the firmware update. You just follow the update on the screen. You basically just double click the installer for the firmware update. You shut your machine down. Then what you're going to do is you're going to press and hold the power button in until the white light on the front of your Mac Mini starts flashing rapidly. Then you'll release it, and then you should start to see that firmware update apply to the Mac Mini. And then after the firmware update has completed, it is recommended that you reset your PRAM on your computer by holding down the Command Option P and R keys when your computer boots up, and that will help clear out the memory and be able to make sure that the system is utilizing the full memory, again, once you get that installed in the computer. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to press and hold the power button down until I see that white light flashing. The firmware update will start its process. And then after that, we should be able to put in our 2 GB DIMM into slot 1, taking out one of our 512 DIMMs, and then we should be able to have a quote-unquote 2,1 Mac Mini. Now that we've successfully upgraded our firmware on our Mac Mini number 1 from a 1,1 to a 2,1 firmware, on the screen in front of you, you'll see the other 2 upgrades I performed on Mac Mini number 6, which is the one I'll be keeping, and Mac Mini number 5, which is another one that I'll be selling on eBay. And yay guys, you made it to the end of the video. I'm super happy. So yes, I know this video has been super long and this project overall has taught me a lot. One thing for sure is it was a lot more to take on than I originally thought. With that being said, let's take a look at some of the benchmarks and the investments. How much money did I invest into this? What are the specs of before and after, and some of those benchmarks with Cinebench, R11, and also Geekbench 2. So my total investment with Mac Mini number 1 was $18.96. What we did with this computer is we flashed it to a firmware version 2,1. We upgraded the hard drive from the 60 GB to the 80 GB hard drive. And for our processor, we upgraded from an Intel Core Duo 1.66 GHz up to an Intel Core 2 Duo 2 GHz. For our RAM, we more than doubled our RAM capacity on this machine from 1 GB up to 2.5 GB. And we left the rest the same. Looking at the Cinebench R11 results, we got some pretty decent results here, with increases about 27% overall on our total scores from before and after. And then Geekbench 2 on our CPU score, that's actually what gained the most here. We saw a 39% increase just by upgrading from a Intel Core Duo 1.66 GHz processor up to an Intel Core 2 Duo 2 GHz processor. Moving on to our second Mac Mini, I invested a total of $35.70 in this machine. Those upgrades were for the 120 GB solid state drive we put into this machine, and then we also upgraded the RAM in this from 1 GB to 2 GB. And since we upgraded the RAM to 2.5 gigs, we were able to load Lion 10.75 on this machine, because again, there is that RAM requirement for Lion to run. It needs at least 2 GB of RAM. Looking at our Cinebench R11 results, they might be a little bit surprising actually, because our after scores are actually worse than our prior scores. However, this does make sense considering we upgraded our computer's operating system. Even though we increased the RAM on it, the overall operating system itself uses more power and more system resources in order to run. So this is why we saw a decrease in performance overall in Cinebench R11. And surprisingly enough, our Geekbench 2 scores stayed exactly the same on Mac Mini number 2. Moving on to Mac Mini number 3, this one we are going to be selling as is because this already had a 250 gigabyte hard drive in it. The total investment on this machine was only $10, and it is again a 1,1 from 2006. Has the 250 gigabyte hard drive, as I just mentioned, with a 1.66 core duo processor with 1 gigabyte of RAM, running Snow Leopard 10.68. Moving on to Mac Mini number 4, we made a total investment on this machine of $10 as well. We're going to be selling this computer as is because, again, this does have that super drive issue with it. This is again a 1,1 from 2006 with a 60 gigabyte hard drive, a Intel Core Duo 1.66 gigahertz processor running with 1 gigabyte of RAM and 10.68 Snow Leopard loaded on it. Moving on to our 5th Mac Mini. This one, again, we only invested a total of $10 in, but we were actually able to upgrade the processor in it from a Intel Core Duo 166 to an Intel Core 2 Duo 183. And this was because we used one of the processors in one of our other Mac Minis that we added even a more powerful Core 2 Duo processor into. We were able to reuse that processor in this machine, therefore giving it basically a free upgrade. Again, even though we were able to flash the firmware on this machine, for some reason on this machine and on the other one a little bit earlier on, I showed you guys here, we unfortunately were unable to get Lion loaded on it. Every time I tried loading Lion onto this machine, it failed, and as did it with the other one that we flashed the firmware on. Moving on to our Cinebench R11 results for Mac Mini number 5, we wound up with a total score of 2569 over the prior score of 2158 prior the upgrade. This overall was a 19% increase in performance. Moving on to our Geekbench 2 results, we did see a pretty good increase actually on the CPU score here, moving from 0.79 up to a 0.99, which again is a 25% increase in CPU performance by just adding in that Intel Core 2 Duo 1.83 gigahertz processor. And finally, moving on to Mac Mini number 6, I made a total investment on this machine of $47.99. Yes, I did invest the most money on this machine because this is the one I am going to be keeping for my personal collection. Again, this is a 2,1 machine from 2007. We were able to go in and upgrade from an 80 gigabyte hard drive and put a 240 gigabyte solid state drive in this machine. Moving on to the processor on this machine, we went pretty much all out on it. We went and upgraded from an Intel Core 2 Duo from a 1.83 gigahertz up to a Intel Core 2 Duo 2.16 gigahertz processor. Again, we could have actually jumped this up to a 2.33 gigahertz Intel Core 2 Duo processor. However, the cost savings there wouldn't have made it worth it. Moving on to the RAM on this machine, it saw a slight bump in RAM. We were able to upgrade the RAM in this to 3 gigabytes. We only had 2.5 gigabytes when we got this machine. And finally, we had OS 10.7.5 installed on this machine before our upgrades, and there was no change there. Finally, moving on to our Cinebench R11 results for Mac Mini number 6, we wound up with a total score of 2868 after the upgrade. Prior to this upgrade, we had a score of 2183. That was an increase of 31% overall. So overall, that was our best increase in performance, especially looking at that floating point number below there on the Cinebench R11 results. Moving on to our Geekbench 2 results here, you can see that our CPU and our MP ratio was definitely by far the greatest increase as well. This is primarily due to the amount of processor speed we were able to add by adding in that Intel Core 2 Duo 2.16 gigahertz processor into this computer. That increase there actually was a total of 47% overall increase on Geekbench 2 results. So pretty substantial increase just for a minimal amount of money. That processor I actually only wound up paying I think about $11 or $12 off of eBay for, so overall definitely a good investment in my mind. So walking away from all this, what did I learn? So overall, this total project investment, including purchasing these 6 Mac Minis and all the upgrades, cost me a total of $132.65. And again, out of all 6 of these Mac Minis, I'm only gonna be selling 5 of them, and that means I'll have to sell all 5 of those combined together for more than $132 in order to make a profit on this. And again, that was the whole intent of this series. Before I wrap up the video today, I want to mention that I overall think that spending, is it worth spending $50 to upgrade a 2007 machine? I think if you were able to get a really good deal on this and go out and invest a little bit of money in some RAM, a solid state drive, and a CPU upgrade, and you kept that price point anywhere between $40 to $50, and you're able to get a halfway decent machine where you can do basic functionalities. Do I think it's worth it? Yeah, I think it's worth it in 2020 to go out and spend $40 to $50 on a computer like this that you're able to install Mac OS on, and you still have a functioning machine. You could also alternatively install Linux on a machine like this, and it would actually run even better most likely, and it would have more support and stuff considering the age of the machine. So again, stay tuned to LoveTech for part 3 of my Mac Mini upgrade project. That's when I'll be revealing, did I actually make a profit on this, and is it actually worth going out and buying like a lot of 4 or 6 Mac Minis that are this age in 2020. Alright guys, that does it for the video here on the channel today. I hope you really enjoyed the video, and again, leave your comments down below. Let me know what future videos you'd like to see here on the channel. And if you haven't followed me on Facebook or Twitter yet, I'm at LoveTech4You. I'll leave the links down below. And I have also started my own Patreon page, so there will be exclusive content over there for my Patreon subscribers, so definitely go check it out. It's patreon.com/LoveTech. And if you learned a thing or two today out of this video, that's great. So if you could help me out by clicking the thumbs up button up at the top and clicking the bell for subscription notifications, it'd be greatly appreciated. We're almost up to 200 subscribers and fastly growing, so I am super, super happy to all my subscribers. I want to thank you again from the bottom of my heart. And until next time, we'll see you in another LoveTech video.